Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is a podcast about memorials and media. Today on the show, I am joined by the writer, journalist, and editor Spencer Bailey. Spencer is a co-founder, along with Andrew Zuckerman, of the Slowdown, a new media company focused on culture, nature, and the future, where he hosts two of my very favorite podcasts, Time Sensitive and At a Distance. He's also an editor-at-large for Phaidon and a contributing editor for Town and Country. He's also the former editor-in-chief of the design magazine Surface. Spencer also recently published the book In Memory of Designing Contemporary Memorials, a book that explores the art, architecture, and design of memorials around the world from the late 20th century to today. And this book is where we start the conversation. Spencer has a personal connection to memorial design that we talk about before discussing how memorials shape our understanding of memories, of stories, and of media. We use this to talk about how he started writing about architecture and design, his time at Surface, and his new company, The Slowdown, and how that, while not necessarily is about design, is a great example of my theory that kind of all cultural criticism is a type of design criticism. This is a really great conversation. I think Spencer has a lot to say about how we tell design stories. Heading into 2021, I'm excited to announce that we're going back to releasing episodes every week. So you'll get even more Scratching the Surface next year. And this is all made possible because of you and listeners like you. So if you enjoy this show, if you want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. In addition to the episodes, which are always free, members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes and other kind of behind the scenes content. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. It truly means so much to me. It really helps keep the podcast going. And so if you like the show and want to see it continue, please consider becoming a member. Thank you, as always, for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Spencer Bailey. You have this new book, In Memory of, which is about the design of contemporary memorials. And I want to start by kind of talk about the timing of this book and the fact that it is coming out in the middle of a pandemic. You've obviously been working on this pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and now it's coming out in a world that I imagine is vastly different than the one you thought it would be coming out in, one where there is so much kind of darkness and death, and people are talking about memory and memorials. How has this moment, these last couple months, changed how you have thought about this book that you've ended up making?
I don't know that it's changed how I think about
Mm,
it, but I actually feel like I was very prepared for this moment
mm,
in a way that I would not have been had I not written the book. Um, and, you know, I spent the better part of 2 years researching, reporting, and writing about mass atrocity, terrorism, genocide. Um, Death and it was not just about those things explicitly, of course. It was about how we remember, how we think about, how we deal with and cope with those things. But obviously, I'm waking up at 5 in the morning pretty consistently and writing about pretty dark, heavy material. And then I wake up one morning and we're in a global pandemic. Literally, like, the week I turned in the copy for the book was the week before New York City went into lockdown.
So let me ask you a different version of the question, and then we can kind of talk about some of the big ideas of the book. But um, maybe less how this moment has changed how you think about the book, but has this moment changed how you think about the kind of general thesis of the book, or the ideas about why we are culturally um, and and globally, in a way, so interested in this idea of constructing memorials and monuments
Mhm.
and memory? Does this moment, does this pandemic, which is global, change any of that thesis or change any of the ideas that you were hoping to communicate in the book?
Well, I think a distinction to bring up early in the conversation, which is important, is that between a memorial and a monument.
Mm,
and
mhm.
and these are blurred lines that have really kind of lost meaning over time. Monuments, though, are typically statues related to war and politics. They're celebrating things like victory over another nation, or about valor and standing up for your rights. They're about, kind of they're about statesmen, they're about soldiers, they're typically about men, typically white men. Memorials, on the other hand, tend to be spatial and abstract. They're about recognizing hardship, about sacrifice. They go into more kind of contemporary issues of trauma and survival and terrorism, as in the case of 9/11. So I think it's important to kind of talk about those separately. I think that obviously they're connected, um, but that they should be distinctive. They should be understood
Yeah,
as distinct things. The most interesting thing to kind of come out of the past, let's say, 8 months since the pandemic really began in full force here in the United States, um, is probably the social and cultural um, results of the pandemic, like how it has shifted our culture and and made things more acute. I think that, we're
right.
now understanding post George Floyd, for example, uh, racial injustice in this country in a way that maybe we weren't before. Um,
Mhm.
these memorials, though, can cause us to think that way quite similarly. Like, if every American was required to go visit the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery and understand the history of lynching in this country, I think we would have a very different country.
This book comes from a very personal place, and I'm not gonna ask you to kind of recount that story. I think you've done that beautifully in the introduction of the book. You did that on the Time Sensitive podcast. I have a feeling every interview that you do about this book is gonna ask you about that. Um, the short summary and like, jump in if I kind of summarize this wrong, is that you were in a plane crash when you were a child with your brother and your mother, along with 111 other people, died. You and your brother and a group of other people survived. And there's a photograph of you being kind of carried away uh, from that accident that has been turned into a statue that is kind of at the site. And so you've had to kind of wrestle with this and think about this your whole life. And this kind of sets up the trajectory of the book in many ways. And a lot of the questions that you ask about in the book, did I kind of give that story
That was
accurately?
uh, almost everything was accurate. I would clarify that the site of the memorial is on the banks of the Missouri River in Sioux City,
Okay.
Iowa, which
Oh,
is
right,
which is separate from the
right.
runway where it took place. But yeah, everything else was accurate. And what's sort of interesting about this entire experience is that it really has to do with media. Um, and I'm sure we'll get into this in this conversation today, but uh, you know, media controls so much of the narrative of how we remember. And I think we forget that because we end up seeing these big constructed, pieces of art and architecture, but they all started from flimsy pieces of paper and newsprint.
Right. What you talk about in the introduction is this kind of weird distance that you feel with that place and with that and that it is you. And you use this to talk about two things which I think are the big themes of the book. And one of them is this move from kind of the literal or the kind of really visual to something that is more abstract, which I want to talk about in a bit. But the other one is this kind of idea of who gets remembered, and this is what you were just starting to talk about in regards to memorials and monuments. Who gets to be remembered? Why? How? Who gets to tell this story? Whose story is this? Something that I talk about a lot on the podcast is this idea that design is ideology made artifact, that it's kind of
Mm,
taking ways of seeing the world and making them concrete. And I think memorials are actually a really interesting example of that I had never considered before. And it is this idea of media where it starts to take on its own story that is
mm,
sometimes separate from the kind of people who actually were there. And I'm interested in how you think about that, how you think about this being a place where
mm,
this question's getting big, but what I'm trying to say is like this is something that we go to. You know, people go and see these sculptures, pieces of architecture, land art that are meant to be memorials that sometimes we don't always have a personal connection to,
mhm,
and we feel something. But then there are people who go who do have a personal connection to, or who were there, like like your story and that memorial, and they were designed by someone else, that are sometimes changing the story, whether consciously or unconsciously. And how do we articulate all of that balance? This idea of like the collective and the personal, and whose story is this, and how do we tell that story? As you visited these places, and you visited about half, I heard you say in another interview, and as you started putting this together, how did you think about this, and how did you think about your place in that as now you're kind of telling some of that story?
So immediately, what comes to mind is that during the research of this book, I read Susan Sontag's book regarding the pain of others, and it's a book length essay that goes deep into ideas about how we look at others who are going through pain or trauma or suffering. And in that book, she talks about how these images can take on a life of their own. And that's certainly the case of what happened with mine. And I have no idea, who in Sioux City decided to make a bronze statue depicting my 3-year-old body being carried, but somebody
Right.
did.
Right.
Nobody checked with my dad. Nobody checked with me. I mean, and if they did check with me, I was a 4-year-old. So, like,
Right. Yeah.
what would I say? Um, and, over time, I've just been so confounded by what it means to be memorialized. I've sat and wondered, like, what does this mean? Like, and I've really wanted to get away from being famous or known for being the little boy down by the river in the statue. Like, that has
Yeah.
not been an identity that I wanted to attach myself to. I've tried to avoid the victim message, the sort of
Mhm.
survivor definition. And we look at survivors in our culture in awe. Like it's survivors literally get put on pedestals. And in my case, um, I was put on a pedestal as a statue. I mean,
Right.
as
Right.
something like if the Missouri River flooded tomorrow, which it still, by the way, does flood fairly often,
Mm.
um, that statue would still be there underwater, or it's going to be around forever. And what does that mean? So it's thinking about that, and thinking about what that narrative means, the hero story.
Mhm.
There's a plaque nearby that defines it as I think it says a symbol of strength, compassion, and unselfish commitment. Well, what about that image makes it worthy of that? I now realize that it fails to achieve that, and it took really the writing of this book to unpack it in a global context, and to also understand art and design and abstraction in a way that allowed me to be able to articulate what actually the issue was. And the issue is that the child being carried motif is a biblical image. Effectively,
Right.
it is.
Right.
It's it's projective of this hero story, but not reflective of the tragic event. And so that's why I don't see myself in it. Um, and it's why when I went back to Sioux City in fall 2019 with my brother Brandon, who had been on the plane with me, that we visited that site and both of us were kind of like, like,
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
we didn't
Yeah.
feel anything. His name is not at the site, nor is the name of anyone else who was on that plane other than me. And
Right.
not even the pilot, Captain Haynes, who helped steer the aircraft to the ground and saved my life. Like, I wouldn't be talking to you right now on this
Right.
podcast were it not for him. And so why do all these myriad experiences get ignored for this projective hero message? It just doesn't make any sense. And, I would love to one day see my mom's name at that site. I would love to see the name of the 111 other people who died. I think that it's important that we don't forget them. And instead, it's a statue with a plaque, a second plaque, by the way. There was one plaque from the inauguration, and then they installed a second plaque to try to help describe it further, basically saying it's based on a photo by this photographer, Gary Anderson, who's a white guy. Um, it's a statue by Dale Lanphier, who's a white guy. He's being carried by Lieutenant Colonel Dennis Nielsen, who's a white guy. And by the way, it's a little 3-year-old white boy. So it's like, why do we live in this culture in which we all think it's okay for just, putting white men on pedestals? And that
Mhm.
that is the conversation that we're now starting to see happen. And, I don't necessarily see um, this statue in the full context of Confederate monuments. I'm not I'm not
Right.
I'm
Right.
not trying to say that. And I think that there was probably some really great intent underlying this, that the community itself went through an enormous trauma and tragedy, and they also had to find a way to heal. And this memorial was a way of them doing that, of showing the strength of this, like, really incredible Midwest community. Just
Mhm.
a month or two before the accident, they had actually run a mock plane crash at the
Oh,
air
wow.
yeah, at the airport. And so they were incredibly prepared. It was an incredibly
Wow.
prepared and resilient situation, and I think they saved many, many lives by being prepared and by being this incredible tight-knit Midwestern community.
I'm I am the one of the kind of arguments that you make in the book that I think directly connects to what you're talking about is this move from the kind of literal, the representational into the abstract. And the memorials that you feature in the book are all kind of abstract. They're more emotive. They're less this, they are not, boy being carried away in the kind of biblical image.
Mhm,
And I have two questions around that.
mhm,
One is kind of how you arrived at that as a framing, and how that kind of connects to this kind of disembodied monument that you see of yourself, uh, and then two, how you think about that kind of abstraction being something that can kind of open up these stories in
mhm,
some way. So how does that relate to kind of you and your own story, and then how does that connect to this larger conversation we're having around collective memory and whose stories get to be told?
mhm. So the statue we've been talking about, which is called the Spirit of Siouxland, is the centerpiece of this memorial site in Sioux City. But when you arrive, there's actually a sort of um, uh, semi-abstract
Mm,
procession that's quite nice. There's a series of uh, 7 large stones, and affixed on each of the stones is a brass plaque with phrases from the rescue workers that were pulled from
mm,
from the press, um, talking about the resilient spirit of the community.
hmm.
And so there is this sort of abstraction as you enter the site, and you understand that it's commemorating something, and that something took place, something very powerful and profound. And challenging and difficult took place, and that there was a strong, resilient response to that. So I think that there is some level of specificity meeting abstraction there that is intriguing and interesting. It's just unfortunate that they decided to make the centerpiece this literal figurative
Right.
statue. Um, I think it's also worth mentioning when I went back last fall with Brandon that we visited runway 22 where the plane had crashed.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the most profound experiences of my life.
Mm.
Even now, I think about it and it gives me pause. I imagine Brandon might say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were both unaware that there was still this remaining section of runway 22, and when we were back in Sioux City, we went to the local Aviation and Transportation Museum, which has a small exhibition on Flight 232. And next to that museum, which is in a hangar, uh,
Mm.
is the runway. And he and I walked up and down the length of the runway that's remaining,
Mm-hmm.
and aesthetically, it was really fascinating because the city has left it there without really doing much to it, and so time has revealed cracks in the asphalt,
Mm.
and these weeds have been kind of growing up through the cracks, and
Mm-hmm.
so it kind of created this very evocative scene. And I just couldn't help but think if I couldn't help but think if there was I couldn't imagine a more fitting metaphor,
Right. Yeah.
you know, to this idea of growing past lingering trauma than these weeds growing through the cracks. And walking down that runway and back slowly with Brandon will be an event of my life that I just will never forget.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine.
I want to also clarify on the subject of memorials that I'm certainly not the first to do a book on the subject. You know, in researching the history and culture of 19th, 20th, and 21st century memorials, what I realized was that most of the texts and the subjects have tended to focus on specific types of memorials or monuments. So, Confederate monuments, Holocaust memorials, the National Mall, 9/11,
Right. Right.
and there's incredible academic scholarship on those subjects. Like I reference several great
Yeah.
university press books in the introduction. There's James E. Young's The Stages of Memory, which for anyone interested in memorialization should read. He's also just a leading scholar on memory studies and memorials. He was on the jury of the 9/11 memorial.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then there's also a great book by Erica Doss called Memorial Mania that looks
Mm.
specifically at memorials in the United States and how we are a nation obsessed or awash in memorials. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
really indebted to that work. That work gave me the framework from which to make the book. Um, I think it's worth noting that while there is all this scholarship, there was not until now a global survey
Yeah.
exploring contemporary memorial making. And, um, you know, one of the best pieces I came across of writing on this subject was a 2002 essay by Michael Kimmelman in the New York Times, where he
Right.
wrote about how minimalism and abstraction have almost sub rosa become, you know, the contemporary way of memorializing, and that really kind of helped serve and became the focus of my book. So you know, I gave significant thought to these subjects and typologies, and I wanted to keep, you know, geographic diversity as a part of it. I wanted to emphasize the blurred lines between art and architecture. I thought all of that was really important.
What's interesting about the book, and I want to kind of use this to kind of talk about your larger work in some way. And but what was really interesting in looking page after page in the book is how they are a blend of sculpture, of landscape, of architecture, of graphic design, of typography. They are really kind of total works of design in some way. And I think, in a way, this fits a lot of your work and the kind of writing that you've done about design. And so you were the editor in chief at Surface Magazine, and obviously a design publication. Where did your interest in design come from? How did you kind of arrive at this subject as a kind of intellectual interest?
Yes, like, all of this book is really a culmination of a lifetime, of this incredibly, at times surreal or unreal experience of surviving a plane crash, to then kind of finding my way into becoming a design uh, focused editor and journalist. Although I would say part of my background is that I am first and foremost an editor and journalist. I do not look or think about myself as a design journalist.
Mm,
I actually am a journalist first. And then, like, my interest in journalism really happened in high school, studying fiction and poetry. And then in college, I went to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, um, realizing that I was never going to make a living writing fiction or poetry. And if I was, I had to just be like so gung ho about it. But I just, you know, I knew I needed a different outlet, and I eventually ended up working at my college's alumni magazine. It was there that I met this incredible editor, Sherry Kimmel, who became a mentor of sorts as well, really showed me the ropes. I had a few professors who made me also, basically realize I wasn't that good of a writer. And and
yeah.
if I wanted to become one, I really had to push myself. So,
Mm,
two of them in particular, Carol Ann Johnston and Susan Parabo. Susan's an incredible novelist. They both completely reshaped my abilities as a writer. So I
mm,
was really able there to learn the craft of writing a story, of writing story, period. And in terms of early design education, I wasn't really thinking along those lines, but over time I've realized I have some memories on that front, like several objects in my dad's house. Like he had the classic Richard Sapper Alessi tea kettle, you know. There were other things like his Toomey briefcase or his Mont Blanc pen. Um, he had this really ugly, gaudy gold Bulgari watch. Sorry, Dad.
yeah.
Uh uh, these stood out to me above everything else. Like, I could tell that they were made at a level of craftsmanship that was so much beyond the other objects around me. And
Yeah.
so that was like kind of formative, in terms of understanding why something that's just made more thoughtfully and better will stand the test of time. And then there were my dad's cars.
Mm.
Well, at any given moment, he had probably like 10 cars, and
Oh, geez.
our driveway looked like a used car dealership. But the cars I especially loved that he had were these 1980s Toyota Land Cruisers, and
Mm.
um, I loved them because of their utilitarian quality, but also the fact that they could just last. So anyway, that's sort of like, I didn't have any design background. I did not grow up in a stylish house, or but there were these signifiers that I think over time have gotten me to thinking about that. And
Well, where did the maybe a better question is where the word design came into your life, and I want to come back to something that you said, which I agree with, that you are not a design journalist necessarily.
mm,
Um, but was that at Surface that kind of design became a focus, or that this word design seemed like a container to hold a lot of the things that you are interested in?
yes, for sure. I would say that given reflection, I've been able to think about how, in fact, my graduate school experience is really where design came into the picture. So, I arrived in New York City after graduating from Dickinson in September 2008. And the day after I signed the lease on my first apartment here, Lehman Brothers collapsed. So I was basically like, I had big idealistic dreams. I'd
Yeah.
previously interned at HarperCollins.
Mm.
I'd spent some time working for the Alumni magazine. I'd worked for a music news website in London. I'd interned at a literary agency in New York.
Mm.
So I felt like I'd built up a decent resume, but I was still a 22-year-old kid in New York without a job entering the worst recession in decades. So
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
I eventually finagled my way into this paid internship apprenticeship at Esquire, which trained me for a big office environment, was like a good sort of ground for that. And during that time, I got into Columbia Journalism School, and I kind of applied on a lark, like not really thinking I would get in, but I did. And it seemed like a really smart thing to wait out the recession and go and
Yeah.
get the reporting chops that as an English major undergrad, I just didn't get.
Right.
And so when I got there, at the time, I don't think they do this anymore, but they had this intro to reporting and writing class called RW1. And I was assigned the beat of gentrification. I had no idea how fortuitous that would be. Like, that beat was my entry point into design by writing about the intersection of culture, society, race, and urbanism. And it led to my first clip in a national newspaper, the New York Daily News. Um, and it was a story about how cupcake shops, like, remember, this was the fall of 2009.
Yep.
So
Yep. Yep.
there's a story about how cupcake shops were contributing to urban development and gentrification. And
Yeah.
Harlem was opening its first cupcake shop at the time. So there were
Mm.
already like 40 some cupcake shops across Manhattan. And so, yeah, I guess you could argue I came to design through cupcakes.
Well, okay. That's a hard question. That's hard for me to now ask my next question. I mean, in a weird way, that actually kind of explains a lot in the way you approach your work. And one of the big things I think, and I've heard you talk about this before, that you did when you were at Surface, is kind of really change the lens of what that magazine could be, or what that kind of editorial framework could be, as something that was kind of solely focused on design, to kind of opening up and thinking about the larger world and how design influences that, which is the
Mhm,
cupcake story in a
mhm.
lot of ways. And I'm but can you talk about that transition and what that was like, of kind of taking this magazine that was fairly well known in design circles, and really thinking about,
Mhm.
less about, hey, we're talking to other designers, we're going to talk about design, we're going to talk about objects, and blah blah blah, and actually kind of look at how this maybe lives in the world and how this actually is influencing things. What is the kind of larger angle here?
Sure.
How did that what how did you kind of come in and make that change, and then what was that like in the process?
I kind of came to that experience wanting to explore areas that did interest me. And I've always been interested in art. I've always
Hmm.
been interested in business and commerce. And design really is the intersection of those two things. And so while I barely knew what design was, I already was engaged and interested in the world of design, even if I didn't think of it in that sort of box. And so
Right.
I was an outsider coming in. Like, I remember when I got an interview with Dan Rubenstein, who was the editor in chief at the time. I could name maybe five architects, like,
Yeah.
and two of them, Zaha Hadid and Frank Gehry, I would later interview for the covers of Surface. So, like,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. Yeah.
crazy. Like, I owe a lot to Dan because he really took a chance on me at a young age. and hired me knowing that I was just an extremely curious journalist who could write a decent narrative, and maybe my lack of design knowledge could be an asset. Like
Right.
maybe in this insidery, navel gazy world of design, I might be able to say things that others aren't. And
Yeah.
so I kind of soon discovered I did have a knack for distilling like the value of good design to a broad audience. And I think we really did shape and grow that surface audience over my time there. Um,
Yeah.
I should say though that like I never imagined I'd become editor, especially
Right.
at age 27. And it happened through a change of ownership. It was a pivotal moment for the company and ultimately for my career.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to clarify as you were telling that story that you started you didn't come in as editor. You started somewhere else, or started at another position and then
Exactly.
became
Yeah.
editor.
I want to make sure that I talk about the fact that, one of the things that was important to me at Surface, and it was sort of my first order of business as editor, um, was to take what had been a magazine that looked at the quote design world and really
Mhm.
recast that as a magazine that looks at the world through the lens of design.
Right. Right.
And there was nobody better, I realized, than Ian Schrager to sort
Mm.
of encapsulate that at the time. He's a
Mhm.
hotelier. I mean, he connects to so many worlds: architecture, interior design, hospitality, art, food, fashion, nightlife, culture. And I felt like he had this high level of sophistication and taste, but he also didn't take himself too seriously. And so there was this amazing mix of like everything I kind of wanted Surface to capture in one person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why Ian was the first cover, and everything kind of snowballed from there. And I never imagined during my tenure we would have Kanye West and Solange
Mm.
Knowles on the cover, but we
Mhm.
did. Or that
Mhm.
or that I would be able to get the like hermetic Peter Zumthor to come out of his
Right. Right.
atelier and come on the cover and come fly to New York and do a talk at the Guggenheim. Like these were things that happened that were just a dream. So, and all that said, like there was also a period of time where I did some reporting for the New York Times magazine,
Mm. Mhm.
and I think it's worth mentioning the first assignment I ever got from them, which was to spend a night at Zuccotti Park with the Sleepers. And this was during Occupy Wall Street. And it's funny, I didn't really consider this design reporting like until thinking about it more recently, but it really is. It was how public space gets used, the lines between public and private, the role of protest and gathering, the sociological significance of what Wall Street means as a neighborhood. So for that job, I shadowed this Israeli photographer, Nadav Newhouse, who told me to meet him at the red sculpture near Zuccotti Park. I
Mm. Mhm.
I didn't realize it at the time, but he was talking about Noguchi's Red Cube. Um,
Right.
and it's so funny how Noguchi connects to so much of my life and career in New York, and maybe we can touch on that. But Nadav and I met at 9 p.m. and spent the night with the Sleepers. Like I was up with him till 9 a.m. the next day. It was exhausting. Deli coffee was definitely involved
Mm.
at some point, but
Mhm.
around 4:30 a.m. in the morning, we found what we'd been looking for, which was in a nearby McDonald's. So it wasn't
Mm.
actually in the park, it was in the periphery of the park.
Interesting.
And it's
Yeah.
oftentimes the scenes that you see on the periphery that are the most interesting. And that's
Yeah.
what I also discovered like through a lot of my reporting and writing is it's like don't look where everybody else is looking, look on the periphery. And I knew that as soon as I saw that scene, that it was so subtle and it spoke volumes, and I just knew it would be what the Times would run in the end, and they did. And it we came across this 20-year-old black woman with a shirtless 19-year-old white guy. They're standing in line. They had a blanket wrapped around the two of them. Behind them in line were these young, like dressed up Wall Street types coming back from clubbing or some fancy night out or whatever. And it was just such a contrast. And the irony, of course, was not lost on me that these protesters, who, by the way, were protesting big banks and corporate America, were ordering chicken fingers and fries from one of America's largest corporations. It was,
Right.
and the woman, I think her name was Core. She was the daughter she's the daughter of a former NYPD officer. So,
Mm,
and she had told me her dad had been on the Freedom Riders bus. She was working at AutoZone to pay her way through art school, and she told me that the guy who was with her, this guy Brandon, had lost his virginity in the park that day.
mm.
Not to her, she said. She was like, "I'm just to clarify." And and Brandon, who was like tipsy after having a few Four Locos, confirmed that he had lost his virginity in the park that day. And then I later had to get confirmations from several other sources, which was like the most strange, bizarre thing to fact check.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Brandon, it turned out, had been a runaway from home. And we discovered this through posts from his mom on his Facebook page, and he had bruises. He'd been beaten up by police, but honestly, some of those bruises also seemed self-inflicted. So it was a very, I mean, he described himself as a vampire slash anarchist. His statements were not the easiest to corroborate. Like, it was just such a trip to report that story, and it defied all expectations. It told this
Yeah.
really human story. Like, you could not have made this up.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could have made it up, but it would have required a
Right.
huge imagination, but it was true. And
Right.
so, what that story kind of taught me was the power of nuance and of understanding and of and what comes with deep reporting, what comes with staying up till 4:30 in the morning and going into the McDonald's and finding this scene and understanding how it connects to these much larger,
Mhm.
social conversations.
Mhm.
And effectively, that's what I was doing at Surface.
This is
And
actually a nice way to connect a little bit to so much of the work that you're doing now, because I think while you were at Surface, I think actually what you were talking about earlier about being a journalist first and design is just a part of that. That comes through in the work and your time at Surface. And I think, your interests kind of emerge. I think the kind of business and commerce side is very clearly there in the things that you wrote and the people you interviewed and the editorial direction at Surface. I think interest in architecture. I think there's an interest in fashion of yours that kind of comes through.
mhm,
I think there's an interest in food that kind of comes in, and that under the Surface umbrella, all of those kind of fit together, even if we might not think of food or chef or restaurant
yeah.
as design specifically. It still kind of fits as design. And what's so interesting to me about you and your work, and especially the Slowdown, which is the new media company, I guess it's like 2 years old around at this
Just
point,
about, yep.
that you started with the photographer Andrew Zuckerman. It's all of those things also. It's like it feels very much like a continuation of that work and a broadening of that work and a deepening of those interests that kind of were fermenting in the Surface time, but design becomes secondary perhaps.
Spot on.
So okay, good, because that's what my question was going to be. Is what I find so interesting about talking to you is we have very similar interests, but I come to it from a kind of deep design education and academic experience, and you come to it from a writing journalism experience. And I never know if when I kind of approach these things, I just have this theory that all kind of cultural criticism is design criticism
Mm,
in a way, and all of these
mm,
stories are really design stories. And when I listen to Time Sensitive and At a Distance, your podcasts with the Slowdown, I think of them kind of as design podcasts. And so my question for you is, can you just, for listeners who don't know, talk about what the Slowdown is, and
mhm.
then talk about how design is a part of that mission?
I mean, the slowdown for us, it was really built out of a mutual frustration. Um, as you mentioned, Andrew does take pictures. He's a photographer, but he's also an artist, a filmmaker, a creative director. I don't know that he would identify himself as any of those things, but we had both been looking at media and frustrated, like wanting to believe that there could be a healthier, more sustainable way for bringing together all these disparate thoughts, like, and do so in a way that's like deep but comprehensible. So bring together art, economics, philosophy, design, architecture, politics, science, technology. Like, those don't need to be separate conversations. And in fact, the issues an architect is thinking about very often are quite similar to what an economist might be thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so we just wanted to create context and clarity around a lot of these issues. And we sort of created a triangle diagram of the three most pressing or relevant issues of our time in our minds, which is culture, nature, and the future. So
Mm-hmm.
it was sort of like organizing all of that, but really it stemmed out of this idea of looking at the slow food movement and
Mm.
understanding that, if we thought about our media similar to how we think about our food, like, where your food
Right.
comes from, how your food is made, enjoying the food that you consume, eating slowly. I think that you can
Mm-hmm.
apply this idea to media. Like, we need media that allows people to slow down, to turn inward, to think a little bit more deeply. You know,
Yep.
people will take the time to consume something that's really well made, and it will make them feel better because that thing came from a place of great integrity and of intent. Like, the reporting was done, the story was fact checked, everything was done to a level of quality that's expected by a person who cares about what they're consuming. Like,
Yeah.
I really love this Chinese notion of qi, like
Mm.
the idea that energy is embedded in everything. Like, if you
Mm-hmm.
consume shitty media, you are going to feel like
Right.
shit. And
Right.
if you take in something that was thoughtfully and consciously prepared, you're going to feel much healthier. Like, I'm not saying that it has to be the media equivalent of eating at Noma, but it
Right.
should be tasty. It should be of quality ingredients. It should not be rushed and flash fried. And most of us right now are eating rushed and flash fried food. We should think about media in the terms of our health. Like, so many of us are just binging on the media equivalent of Big Macs, fries, and a Coke every day,
Right.
but we don't
Right.
but we don't think about it in those terms, unfortunately.
My sense was, that you were interested in these things at surface, but just, with the like the grind of the magazine and all of that, it's like the slowdown is a way to actually go deeper on all of these subjects that you were interested in. I'm interested in where you think design fits into the slowdown and the conversations that you're having on the slowdown. And you're kind of saying design is a part of all of this, but do you see these as shows about design, or do you see design as a component here?
It's funny. It's like I almost don't want to use the D word, you know.
I know.
It's like I feel on some level that uh that we're better off bringing designers onto the show, but calling them something else. Um,
Mm.
and
Oh, interesting.
and I only say that because I feel like design currently has this rap that it's almost like something inaccessible to many, and
Mm.
and I think that that relates to media and publications. And I realize I'm saying this as a former design magazine editor, but I think that design can and should be part of the larger discourse, but that it should be embedded within. So, notice earlier I said culture, nature, and the future. I didn't say art, architecture, design, fashion, and technology. Um,
Right.
I think that we try to, as a culture, identify things or put things in boxes that's in a way that's really unhelpful. And,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I think that, when you look at how um, disciplines can transcend, it's really unhelpful to describe most people as this or that.
Right. Right.
For time sensitive, our podcast, that's sort of a profile show of leading minds. That's what we describe them as, like leading minds. We do say business, the arts, and beyond, but the idea is that it's really about the beyond. It's like,
Mm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
these are people contributing to the larger conversation, and they're concerned with the planet we all share. And in this moment of, a climate crisis, a climate emergency, whatever you want to call it, I think that everybody is a human on this earth. We're all on what Buckminster Fuller would call spaceship Earth. And like I think it's really important to think about how tiny we all are, these little specks on this big planet, and the importance of understanding our relationship to the planet. And I think time is such a sort of brilliant conceit in which to explore that.
Yeah.
um, and time is a subject that has gotten everyone we've had on the show so far has really been able to talk about their lives in a way that goes so much deeper because it's through this lens of time. It's not through this lens of their career or their profession. But it's talking about very specific visceral moments in time.
Right.
And
Right.
and I think At a Distance obviously is incredibly influenced by Stuart Brand and the whole Earth
Hmm.
catalog, and looking at our world and our planet and this pandemic at a distance.
Right. And it's interesting. We started this conversation talking about how your book came out at a like strangely fortuitous time. Uh, and in a way, I feel like the same is true of the slowdown. Like I
It's
think,
not lost on me that we're a company called the Slowdown in a global slowdown. It's a very
yeah,
strange, peculiar
and
place.
and so my question is kind of what the first question of this conversation was is how has this moment, to kind of bring this full circle in a way,
Uh,
how has this moment changed, or has it changed at all, the mission or the goal or the approach of what you're trying to do with the slowdown now that everybody is kind of thinking about this and is forced to slow down, and you know this is something that is much more top of mind than it was when you started it 2 years ago.
yeah. Well, it came out of this feeling that we were all just going at this untenable pace,
Hmm.
and that a slowdown was imminent. Like it was going to happen. It could have been a pandemic. It could have been
Hmm.
environmental disaster. I mean, we have multiple slowdowns going on right now. We're all just
Yeah.
very focused on this big global
Right.
one
Right.
that's
Right.
impacting all of us, and that's killed nearly 1 million people on Earth. Like I, I think that it's important to understand that uh, there are other forces that are going to force us all to slow down, um, and
Hmm.
that this is part of this is not us creating a movement. It's us looking at a movement and various movements that are happening all over the globe, big and small, and trying to create a hub through which to explore, talk about, and connect the disparate and various ideas that are kind of bubbling up to the surface. And so I think that that's in large part what we're doing and thinking about is how do we bring clarity to these things, and how do we do so in a way that's going to engage people deeply. And
Right.
one of our ways of doing that is through the five senses. So we've also
Hmm.
created this weekly newsletter that's structured and
Hmm.
organized around see, touch, hear, taste, smell. And it's sort of this idea of like making the digital physical and the physical digital, and
Yeah.
getting people to engage with speed and cadence and pace in their life in a way without being prescriptive. We're not telling people how to live. We're kind of just providing really interesting thoughts, ideas, and putting you know people whose perspectives on the world we think need to be heard. But yeah, I'm definitely thinking about those things, and design writers I've always liked, and people in the world of design that I've always admired tend to be those that reach outside the bounds, that reach beyond the like kind of like really didactic, navel gazy kind of descriptions of what design is or isn't, and actually show that design is everywhere, and it's embedded in practically everything and impacts everything we see, touch, and do.
Yeah, I mean, we can't see each other right now, but I just have the biggest smile. I agree with that, 100%. I have two final questions. These are the two questions that I use to end all of these
Mhm.
conversations. Um, we talked about the book that just came out. We've talked about kind of the work with the slowdown. What's next for you? What are you kind of thinking about? What's top of mind for you right now, or what are your kind of future plans?
Um, Slow down, slow down, slow down. Uh, no,
Right.
I mean, it's really the bulk of my focus is on building this company with Andrew. We do some client work on the side to make it work
Mm,
financially, and we really want to view this as like a platform for building something that is a sustainable model for media. And we're not sure how we're going to get there. We're early in this, about 18 months, and we have seen an incredible growth. Like time sensitive is
mhm,
nearing 1 million downloads in a
mm.
year and a half. um, so we're feeling like we're building something substantial, but again, it's like baby steps, bit by bit. And so that's my big focus. I also have a couple things I can't publicly say yet. Brewing on the Phaidon front, and I do a little bit of
Mm,
freelance writing. I'm a contributing editor at Town and Country magazine, so
mhm.
covers some architecture and design. And again, that's sort of a way to communicate and write about architecture and design to an audience that doesn't typically think about that at the fore of their minds. And Hodinky magazine, the watch magazine,
Oh, yeah.
I've been writing about design and architecture a bit for them. I did a feature on Noguchi Zakari light sculptures, a profile
Mm,
of
mhm.
Mira Nakashima, who's carrying her father's legacy forward while also carving a name out for
Yeah.
herself. And the restoration of Eileen Gray's E1027 house, I covered
Oh,
that for
right.
them. And in their issue this fall, I wrote a piece on the restoration of the Rothko Chapel in Houston.
Oh,
So
nice.
they've become this really great platform for me to go deep into kind of
Yeah.
historical design writing, which has been really, really fun. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's, on the whole, that's sort of where my mind is at, is really deep in the slowdown. And um uh we're exploring several other platforms and potential podcasts for 2021. So
Oh,
those
nice.
are kind of in early stage development. And yeah, we'll see kind of where things go. But we have an idea that this is just the beginning, and
Yeah.
understand that there's really great potential for what it is that we're building.
Yeah. I love that. My last question is, I just wanna know what you're reading right now.
I'll say that I'm not really reading design books.
Yeah. No, I was not expecting a design answer for this question.
um,
Everybody always says that when I ask that question.
yeah. uh, I guess since the start of the pandemic, I've probably read around 8 or 9 books, so like one a month.
Okay.
And right as I was finishing In Memory Of, I was reading, or I had just finished reading The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk,
Mm,
which I've been
mhm.
telling everyone who's interested or dealing with trauma, which is basically all of us, let's face it,
Mhm.
to read this book. And it's not surprisingly been on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while. And I quote and reference the book in the introduction to In Memory Of, because he talks about how after the Vietnam War, the labeling of PTSD and the understanding of trauma really came to the fore in a way that it had not before. And I think that really impacted memorial making.
Mm,
And so, I don't know, for all of us going through this
yeah.
crazy experience of the pandemic, I definitely recommend that book. I've also been turning to and reading all of Rebecca Solnit's books.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
So, like, A Paradise Built in Hell was incredibly inspiring. I actually,
Mhm.
it was on At a Distance, our first episode with Bill McKibben.
Oh, right.
He mentions that book, and I was just like, I have to go get this book. And when I ordered it, it was back ordered because so many people at the
Mhm.
beginning of the
Mhm.
pandemic were ordering it. It's a book that's ultimately about human resilience and how we can rise up for the better in moments of disaster. I would say it's actually there's an element of design writing in that book.
Yeah, yeah, for
And
sure.
I'm currently on Hope in the Dark, uh,
Mhm.
which, though it was largely written about things going on 15, 20, 25 years ago, it's so timely right now.
Yeah.
Um, and Rebecca's writing on feminism, the environment, politics, art, and also importantly memory. Um, all of it, I think, is just so profound. Like, she might be my favorite contemporary writer.
Yeah.
Um,
Sounds right.
I also just finished The Unreality of Memory by Elisa Gabbert.
Oh.
It's another book that goes into disaster and unpacks the complexity of remembering. So that's one that I would recommend. And I'm about halfway through Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, which I'm really,
Oh, yeah.
really enjoying. It's about America's Great Migration, and I really want to read her next book, or her newest book, Cast,
Yeah, that's on my list too.
after that. But I mean, I could tell you a bunch of design writers I like too.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, let's hear them.
um, well, I think design writing is interesting because I define it quite broadly. But I think top of my list is Michael Kimmelman, who came to design writing through art. And I know that some people view him as like, oh, he's not a true architecture critic. Whatever that means. Like, I think his writing on cities and community development and equity, public space, urban design, it's really, I mean, he's thoughtfully showing how architecture is expansive, not how it's a building on a pedestal. And he's a classically trained pianist, and it shows in his work. Like, there's a beauty and a grace and a musicality to his writing. Like, I also think as an art critic, he was so exceptional. And when I interviewed him for Time Sensitive, I went so deep into the archive.
Yeah.
I actually his first lead ever for the Times was Time has generally been a good editor. And that was like the most fortuitous fodder for an
Yeah,
opening of an interview I think I've ever found.
that's awesome.
Um, you know, I'm sure listeners on this podcast are familiar with Alexandra Lang.
Yep.
I
She was my second, interview
Oh,
ever for this podcast.
fantastic. Yeah, her book, Writing About Architecture, really helped shape a lot of my
Me too.
thinking.
Mhm.
Glenn Adamson is someone I really
Yeah.
admire. He wrote the ultimate takedown of Mark Newson's Gagosian show last year in Freeze
Right,
magazine.
right. I remember that.
And I loved his book, Fewer Better Things, which came out right as Andrew and I were getting the Slowdown going. And it
Mm,
relates to so much of what Andrew and I are doing, but it's kind of coming more from a design and craft perspective. Um, to state the obvious, Paul Goldberger,
yep.
Building Up and Tearing Down was really informative to me. And even more obvious probably to everyone is Robert Caro's The Power Broker. Like,
Oh, yeah.
the summer
Yeah.
before entering Columbia Journalism School, at least when I was there, we had to read The Power Broker. It was like a way.
Oh, wow.
The school had it as like a way of familiarizing new students with New York City and the techniques of
Mm,
investigative reporting. So, Carol's level of research is something to aspire to, even though I
yeah.
will never ever reach that
I know.
kind of
I know.
obsessive fastidiousness. I can
I
try.
know.
I guess I can try. And then two other writers who just always, like, for me, I just really find they're on the periphery of what we might term design writing, but I think that they really capture something that's true. And one is Edmund DeWall.
Oh, I just bought his book.
Y-
It's the next on my list,
yeah,
the hair.
Hair with the Amber Eyes.
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
bought that last week.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a design writer per se, but like, I think The White Road could certainly be considered design
Mm,
writing, or at least craft writing. And then Leonard Coran, who we just had on
yeah,
at a
yeah.
distance, he's the founder of Wet Magazine, and um, I love his book Wabi Sabi, and his newest
Mhm.
book, Musings of a Curious Aesthete, is a fun read. Leonard just boils things down into really
Yeah,
simple, fun sentences and makes you know he describes what it is to be an artist in a way that I find incredibly relatable.
I agree.
His writing is so refreshingly spare and minimalist, and I don't often associate the word aesthetic with writing, but with
Mm.
Leonard's prose I would. So that's sort of like that's like a long reading list, I know, but
No, that was great.
and
That was
my final obsession would probably be Noguchi. I have a big library of Noguchi books at home, and I'm constantly turning to those and constantly thinking about Noguchi's work in the context of who we are, how we got here, where we're going. I really don't think there's too many figures quite as relevant as Noguchi, and unpacking all of that.
that was such a great list, and I feel like we could talk for another hour just about Noguchi, um, because I feel the same way about him that you do. Um, this conversation was so interesting to me. I found the book so profound and moving and really enjoyed it. And as a podcaster, I get asked all the time about like what podcasts I listen to, and the fact is I don't actually listen to that many podcasts. And since the pandemic, I like can't listen to podcasts anymore unless I'm running. But the podcast that has sustained me running over the last 8 months is At a Distance. It's the one that I recommend to everybody, and so I am a fan of that and time sensitive as well. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was so great.
Thanks, Jarrett. This was a pleasure to be here.
This episode was recorded on October 19th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.